Hi guys, welcome to Cloud Tech. In this video, we are going to look at Spring Boot CRUD application. So we are going to practically demonstrate how to create Spring Boot application from scratch and implement CRUD functionality in it. So let's get started. First thing is to create a Spring Boot application. So I'm going to take help of Spring Initializer. This is a website which helps you create Spring Boot application from scratch. So let's go to this website, Spring Initializer. It has various options, but we want the combination of Maven project and Java project. So we are going to use this for this demonstration. Let's go to the metadata part, which is group. So in our case, the group is going to be com.cloudtech. So this will be my package name of the project. And the artifact name is going to be CRUD because we are designing CRUD application. So the next part is which version of Java we are using. We are using Java 8. So we have to select that in the specification. Now we are going to add dependencies to our project. I'm going to add three dependencies. The first dependency is going to be web because we want to design our REST controller that comes under web. So let's add web dependency. Then I'm going to add the JPA. JPA is where your entity can be annotated with JPA annotation. JPA stands for Java Persistence API. And the last thing is I'm going to add PostgreSQL driver. So this will be acting as a driver between our application and our database. So after doing all this, let's try to generate the project. So I clicked on generate the project. So once the generation is completed, the project gets downloaded in my downloads folder. So let's try to copy this to a different folder known as projects. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to unzip this to extract in Eclipse. So I'm going to extract this within C projects and CRUD. So let's try to extract this. After extracting, I got a folder and I'm going to copy this path because I want to import this project to my Eclipse. So my Eclipse is open. I'm going to import this project. So to import a project, you need to click on import projects. And this is a Maven project. So we are going to select existing Maven projects. Let's click on next and I'm going to add the path where my project resides. Now I'll press enter. After pressing enter, I'll finish. So it will take a while for Eclipse to import my project and download my Maven dependencies. So now the project is imported in my Eclipse and we got the package name as com.cloudtech.crud. So it has one class, which is the starting point of your Spring Boot application. So let's get started with our CRUD part, which is create, read, update, and delete. For that, we are going to create various folders in it. So the first package is going to be your entity package. Entity package is where all your entities reside for your application. And after that entity, we are going to create a repository package. So let's try to create a new package known as repository. So new and others. So let's go to this and select package. And the package is going to be repository. And I want to create one more package known as controller, where our controller will reside. So let's create that controller package, controller. All right, so we have repository package, we have entity package, we have controller package. We need one more package, which is a service package where our services will reside. So let's create a service package. All right, our package structure is ready now. And so we have one base package where our starting point, which is CRUD application, resides the file. And then we have four packages: controller, entity, repository, and service. So let's now create the entity. We are going to use employee entity for this example. So let's try to create a class as our model, which is employee. So I am creating employee class and I want to have three fields. I'm going to use three field example in this application. So it is going to be private int ID. ID is going to be an identifier for this employee. As you had roll number while you were in your school. So similarly, ID is a unique number which is given to all the employee. Then I'm going to have name of the employee. So this is going to be string, name of the employee, and then I'm going to have age of the employee, which is again going to be an integer. So these are the three fields I'm going to have in my database as well. So let's try to generate getters and setters of these three fields. So I'm going to generate getters and setters. Our three field, I'm going to copy this to the top of the class, so it will be more visible. All right, so we have our entity ready now. Now we want to annotate this entity to make it JPA compliant. So there are two annotations. One is at the rate entity annotation. So let's see, we have entity. Okay, so I'm going to have at the rate entity, and I'm going to have at the rate table annotation. I want to give table name, and I want table name to be employee. If you don't give this, still it is okay, because JPA is intelligent enough to give table name correctly on your behalf. All right. Now, after giving entity and table, entity is where we are marking this class as an entity, and table is where we are telling that we want the table name to be employee in our database. Now the next part is giving the primary key for your entity class. So primary key is going to be our ID field, and we give primary key by using at the rate ID, which is an annotation from JPA, and we want this value to be auto-generated. So to auto-generated this value, we are going to make use of generated value annotation. So these primary key will be auto-generated for us, and we don't need to worry about generating it in our code programmatically. So we designed the entity. We are good with the entity part. Let's now go to our repository part. So now we are going to create a repository. So let's try to create an interface. In Spring Boot world, the repository is not a class, it's an interface. So you are going to create an interface, and I'm going to give this name as this interface name as employee repository. So let's try to give employee repository, and I'm going to finish. So there is a requirement in the Spring Boot. If you want to mark something as repository, then you have to use at the rate repository annotation. So I'm going to use at the rate repository annotation, which resides in our stereotype. So let's try to mark this, and you have to extend this with the interface provided by Spring Boot. So there is something called as JPA repository. So we can use this interface, and we can extend our repository with JPA repository. So there are two generic parameters that JPA repository takes. First is T and the second is ID. So the T part is your entity, the entity which you want to save to the database to get from the database. So you add this employee as the first parameter, and the second parameter is the data type of your primary key. So the data type of our primary key is integer. So we are going to add that data type to our repository. So it is going to be integer. All right. So we have to provide only this much information to our repository, and this repository will be capable enough of creating, updating, deleting, and fetching the records from our database. So that's about the repository. So the next thing that comes to the mind is creating a service. So first we are going to create the service just to add values to the database. So let's try to create the service. We are going to create a new class, and I'm going to mark this as employee service. So this class will act as a service. So all the business logic of your application resides in your service class. So let's try to mark this class as at the rate service. So just by giving this annotation, Spring Boot knows that this class is acting as a service. Now, in every service, we try to inject our repository class. So let's try to inject the repository class that we just created, which is our employee repository. So I'm going to employee repository, and I'm going to give this name as employee repository. You're free to give any name that you want, and just auto wire. You want to auto wire this into employee service. What do you mean by auto wiring? Auto wiring is where you are asking Spring Boot to give me an instance of employee repository. So Spring Boot will create an instance, a new instance of employee repository, and will inject in employee service. So let's now try to go ahead and create getters and setters for this. So I'm going to create getters and setters for your employee repository. So my employee service is completely set up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the logic for saving an entity to the database. So to write the logic in service, what we have to do is we are going to write a save method. So let's try to save an employee to the database. So to save an employee to the database, I'm going to write save method, and this save method will take employee which is coming from your client, which is going to be your UI. So let's try to get the employee and emp. And the only thing you have to do to save an employee to the database is call the repository and call the save method in the repository. So if you pass the employee object that you are getting from the client and just return this to the client back. So here what we are doing, here we are writing a method in our service and we are calling the save method of repository. So all these methods are predefined in the repository. So when you have your JPA repository, it gives you a whole bunch of methods for saving, for updating, for fetching, and for deleting. So you don't have to write anything yourself. So this is the beauty of Spring Boot. So I write this save method. This is going to save an entity to my database. Now the last part is writing the controller. So that will complete our adding flow to add the entity to the database. So I'm going to create one more class, and this class is going to be my employee controller. So this is my employee controller. This is going to act as a REST controller. So this controller is the main thing that we want to design. To mark anything as controller, you have to write @REST controller. So let's annotate this class with @REST controller. And the next thing is I'm going to also use request mapping because I'm making this class specifically for employees. So I am going to add request mapping, and I want all the endpoints to be prepended with employees. So this is going to be my employee controller. Now we are writing only the first flow, which is adding an entity to the database. So let's try to inject our service, which we just created, employee service. So employee, EMPLO, employee service, and I'm going to give the name as employee service. All right. And I'm going to auto wire this. And the similar logic applies where we are auto wiring employee service in our employee controller. So whenever you auto wire, just make sure you add getter setter. You can use various libraries for this, for example, Lombok, but I'm not using this here. So I'm creating getter setter myself. Now, for saving an entity, we want @post mapping. So as we are writing the flow for saving an entity, so let's try to create a public method, and it is going to return you the employee, and I'm going to give the name as add employee. So you can add any name to your method, but add employee is convenient for me, and it is going to take the request body which is coming in your request. So there is one annotation known as request body. It takes the JSON and it converts the JSON to the employee. So we are going to pass the JSON from our Postman, and that JSON will be converted to the employee object. So let's now try to add employee to our database using service. So to add an employee, just call your employee service and call your save method. So I'm going to call this. All right. And I'm going to return this to my client. So whatever is saved to the database will be also returned to the client. So till now what we did, we create a repository, we create a service, and now we created a controller. This completes the add flow. Before that, we just want to add one annotation, which is post mapping. So make sure you add this post mapping whenever you are trying to create an entity. The post mapping signifies we want to create a new entity in our database. So that's it for for adding a record in your database. So, and now we are going to add application.properties. I have application.properties ready. I'm going to explain you what that means. There is a properties file, application.properties, and you have to give the details of your database in this properties file. Now let's look at the details as we are using PostgreSQL database. So I'm going to use PostgreSQL, and my database resides on localhost. If your database is residing on some remote server, then you can give the IP address of that remote server. And my database runs on 5432, which is the port where PostgreSQL runs, and my database name is Office. So I have created one database named as Office in my PostgreSQL, and the username is PostgreSQL and the password is admin. Apart from that, keep everything as it is, and that is something called as dialect. So you have to specify a dialect. When you Google, you will get this dialect from Google. So now we are all ready to start the application and check if we are able to save the entity. Before that, I'm going to select and check if there is anything in my database table. So there is nothing in my database table, and I'll start my application. So to start the application, you can either start or debug the application in your Eclipse. So the application is starting up. Just give it a while to start. It takes around 10-20 seconds to start your application. All right. So now my application is started, and it is running on 8080 port. So if you don't specify any port, by default it runs on your 8080 port. As you can see here, 8080. Now I'll try to create an entity. So to create an entity, I'm going to give this name as PQR, and I'm going to give age as 35, and I'm going to post because we have written post mapping. So I'll just send this request, and as you can see, the employee got created with the ID 9, name as PQR, and age as 35. So let's make sure it got saved in our employee table. So select start from employee. I'm going to hit this, and as you can see, the ID is 9, age is 35, and the name is PQR. So we are successfully able to add entity to our database. Now there are 3 more operations that remain. So these are very important operations. So let's try to do quickly these 3 operations. So these 3 operations are getting the employee, updating the employee, and deleting the employee. So I'm going to write code for all this quickly. And to get the employee, we are going to use @get mapping. So we are going to write public employee and get employee. So get employee, EMP, and we are going to give identifier of the employee that we want to get from the database. So this is going to take an identifier, which is going to be your integer. So I'm going to write integer ID, and I'm going to use the repository. So you have to call the repository, employee repository, and you have to, there is a method known as find by ID. Find by ID is a method where it takes your identifier, which is your primary key, and gives back the record from the database to your application. So I passed find by ID, and I'm going to return this employee to my client. So let's see what error it is giving. Type mismatch. Okay, so it returns an optional. We have to get an entity back from that optional. Now it will return an employee. So we wrote one method get employee, and it returns the employee instance from the database where it matches the identifier before returning the employee. The get is done. Now we are going to write an update. I'm going to write public update entity also returns an employee, and I'm going to write this method as update, and this takes employee from the client where you want to update the fields. So you are receiving one employee from the client, and you want to update the values from this employee to the database. So updating is a 2-step process where we want to find the employee from the database and then update it. So let's try to find the employee from the database. To find the employee from the database, we are going to use employee repository find by ID. So this is going to be find by ID, and ID is going to be the ID that is passed by the client. So we have get ID. This identifier gives us the ID of the employee, and then we are going to call the get method. All right, so we got the employee from the database. Okay, EMP equal to this. this employee is from the database. Now we have to add all the fields from the incoming employee to the database employee. So to do that, I'm going to use dot set name. Okay, and this is going to be employee dot get name. All right, and I'm going to use emp dot set age. So these are the two fields that we are setting, and it is going to be from employee get age. All right, so we have the updated employee. Now we want to update this in our database. So let's try to call save method. Employee repository doesn't have update method, it has only save method. Okay, so you are setting all the fields. Now you are updating the employee, and we want to return this employee back to the client. Now we wrote two methods. One is to get the employee and one is to update the employee. So let's see in the controller, I'm going to write the appropriate associated method for these two things. Let's try to add public employee. I'm trying to add method for getting an employee, get employee. So this will give me the employee from the database. All right, and this will take only one field, which is the identifier of your employee. So to get the identifier, there is something called as path variable. Path variable is where you get the value from the URI. So you are going to give a URI, and that URI will have the primary key for your employee. So path variable, and this variable name is going to be ID. All right, and you have to annotate this method with get mapping, because we want to get something from the database. All right, and this get mapping will have the path, and I'm going to specify the name of the name of the identifier, which is your ID in this case. So it is going to be ID. All right, so we are all set, and now we want to fetch the employee from the database and then return to the client. So I'm going to call employee service dot get employee, and I'm going to pass the identifier, and I'm going to return this to the client, and we are going to test this using Postman. So let's try to run the application to check the get flow, and I think get flow is all established. So we created an entity and we got the identifier as 9. So I'm going to call the get method. Whatever we pass here, this 9, this variable is going to be caught by our ID. So path variable makes sure whatever is passed in the URI is caught in this ID. So the application is started, and I am going to pass this 9, and let's send the request. Okay, so I sent the request, and we got the entity back, which is ID is 9, name is PQR, and age is 35. The get flow is all working. Now only two things remain. One is your update and one is your delete. So update is also simple. In the controller class, I'm going to write public, and I'm going to update the record. So for update, we use something called as put entity. Put entity is an annotation which we use for updating an employee. So let's try to write update employee method, and update employee will take the updated employee from our Postman. Okay, so this is going to be an employee, and employee. As we are using request body, so request body takes the JSON and gives the employee. So I'm going to use the same thing here in update employee. And for updating, we use the annotation known as put mapping. Okay, so put mapping is used for updating records in your database. Post mapping is used to creating records, and put mapping is used to updating the records. All right, so that's all, and let's try to call our employee service. I'm calling employee service dot update employee. So we are getting the employee from our Postman, and we are updating the employee in our database. So let's try to run this and check if everything works fine. So I'm going to debug this application. The application is starting up. Meanwhile, I'm going to show the record in the employee table. So let's try to select the record. We have one record with age as 35 and name as PQR, and the identifier is 9. Okay. And now what we are going to do is we are going to update that record, and the update record will be, the name will be ABC. We want to update PQR to ABC. I'll make it caps, and age as 33 rather than 35. It should be 33. Let's make it 18. So I'll make it 18 to be more clear. And we are going to put the entity. So put signifies we are updating the record in the database. So let's try to send the request. Okay, so I'm sending the request. The request is successful. Whenever there is 200, it means the request is successful. So after successful execution, the earlier value was 35 and PQR. Let's try to select and run this. Now it is ABC and 18. So the update functionality is successful. Now the last thing is, which is deleting an entity from the database. So deleting an entity is quite straightforward. You just go to your service and you write a delete method. So I'm going to write, I'll stop the server before writing anything. So and I'm going to return a string which returns if the record is successfully deleted or not. So this is going to take an integer identifier of the record that we want to delete. So this is the primary key of the employee, which is 9 in our case. All right. So let's try to call employee repository dot delete method. So delete by ID is a method. So I'm going to pass the identifier of the entity I want to delete. And after deleting the record, I just return entity deleted. Okay, and I'm going to append the ID of the entity that we just deleted. So that's it for delete. And now we are going to call this method from the controller. So for deleting, we use @delete mapping. So let's try to add the method in the controller for deleting an entity, and we are going to return a string delete employee. Okay, delete employee, employee, and this will take an identifier of your entity, so which is an ID. So this is again going to take a path variable, integer ID. All right, and I'm going to annotate this with delete entity, DELE, delete mapping. Sorry, delete mapping, and delete mapping takes a path variable. So as we saw, path variable has to be specified like this. I'm going to copy this and paste it here. Okay, now we wrote a method in service. We are going to call that method employee service dot delete, and we are going to pass the ID of the entity that we want to delete, and we are going to return that thing back to the point. So that's all for delete. Let's test this delete method. For deleting, we have to use the method as delete, and we have to give the ID, which is 9 in our case. So let's try to check. So I got, let's try to delete the entity, and I got an, I think I got, no, I never started the server. So let me start the server. I'm starting the server. Okay, so let the server get started. It takes 5-10 seconds. Okay, and once the server gets started, we will execute the entire flow starting from adding an entity till deleting an entity. So we'll cover this end to end. So my server is started. Let's try to remove this. Okay, the entity deleted, which is 9, and I'm going to call, I'm going to execute SQL for this and see there is no record in the database. So let's try to, we are done with the CRUD application. Let's try to run end to end. Now I'm going to create an entity known as XYZ, and the age is going to be 40. Okay, so let's try to create an employee. Okay, so we got the ID as 10, and let's go and check in the database. Now we got 10, age is 40, and name is XYZ. Now the next step is getting an entity. To get an entity, we pass the identifier, which is 10, and I'll click on send. We got the name as XYZ and the age is 40. So get is also working correctly. Now we are working. Now we are going to update an employee. So the ID is 10, and the value is going to be it is already XYZ. So I'm going to make it as, for example, Rohan, and I'm going to make the age as 20. So let's try to execute this. Rohan and 20. Let's try to see if it is reflected in the DB. Yes, it is reflected, row 1 and 20. Now, finally, I'm going to delete that entity. So to delete an entity, we pass 10 as an identifier. So let me hit it. Entity deleted and the identifier is 10. I'll go in my employee table and see if the entity is deleted. So after executing the query, there is no more record in the table. So employee is deleted. That's all for this video. Hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you guys for watching.